Welcome to the Thinking Practitioner Podcast,
a podcast where we dig into the fascinating issues, conditions, and quandaries in the massage and manual therapy world today.
I'm Whitney Lowe.
And I'm Til.
Welcome to the Thinking Practitioner. The Thinking Practitioner Podcast is supported by ABMP, Associated Bodywork and Massage Professionals. ABMP membership gives professional practitioners like you a package including individual liability insurance, free continuing education, and quick reference apps, online scheduling, and payments with Pocket Suite and much more.
ABMP's CE courses, podcast, and Massage and Bodywork magazine always feature expert voices and new perspectives in the profession, including you, Whitney Lowe, myself, Til. Thinking Practitioner listeners can save on joining ABMP at abmp.com/thinking. Okay, who's our guest today, Whitney?
Well, speaking of expert voices, we are very delighted to have Mr. John Sharkey from Dublin, Ireland with us today. And John, thank you so much for taking some time. I'm looking forward to a fascinating discussion, delving into some great stuff with you. So welcome to the Thinking Practitioner Podcast.
Well, thank you to both. It's a real privilege. I'm delighted. I'm really thrilled, psyched to be here.
John, can you take a few minutes to introduce yourself to our audience? Tell them a little bit about what you're doing and what your primary focus and work is. But you've been all over the map doing all kinds of things for many years. But I would like our audience to kind of get an appreciation for the depth of the things that you've accomplished here.
Sure. I mean, I started out in the massage therapy world in 1977. And since that time, I've gained undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in exercise physiology and in anatomy. And in fact, the people who were the early influencers for me, these were people who, once they realized that I had an interest in the human body, we didn't have a health fitness industry in Ireland. At that time, it grew, and I always knew that I had an interest in the body. And they said to me, well, anatomy and physiology will be the rocks upon which you're built. And so I listened to that, and that's why I went and got, specific degrees in that area. And I love all things, human body. I've had the great privilege of being able to work with colleagues like Professor Carlos Stecco and Dr. Robert Schleip. And I work with them on a reasonably regular basis. I mean, they're just amazing individuals. And, you can't help but soak up, the information from these guys. So I'm also teaching what we call European neuromuscular therapy. We specialize in the treatment of chronic unresolved pain. And I guess people would also relate the word fascia and fascia science to me. But one of the things I would say is that I find the word fascia a little bit reductionist, and therefore I would like to think that I'm more than just fascia. But
all right, so we'll have to take off on that a little bit. So tell me about that. Why fascia is reductionist, the term there?
Yeah, so for somebody to be able to have a meaningful discussion, you need to be able to agree on what it is that you're talking about. We'll come back to this word maybe in a couple of minutes' time, stretching, because people use the word stretching. Now, I find that when I'm traveling the world, if I'm in Australia or New Zealand or South Africa or I'm in the North Americas, and if I say stretching, people will nod their head. And then what I will do is I might go a little bit further to say, can you write down in just a couple of sentences what you mean by stretching? And then I get people to read out what they've written. And honest to goodness, you will find that in a room of 100 people, you will get 30, 40 variations on the theme, and they will be convinced that everybody was thinking the same thing, when in fact that's just not the case. So I think it's worthwhile to take time out to actually say, well, look, when I'm talking about whatever the topic is, this is what I mean. Is that what you mean? And people will often say, well, no, that's not quite what I was thinking of. And that's great, because now what you do is you reach consensus. And now everybody's on the same page. And I believe then we can have what I refer to as a conscious experience, because that's really what actually helped to develop consciousness in us humans, was the gift of language and vocabulary. So fascia, let's stop and think about some of the words that we relate to fascia. What words do you guys relate to fascia? Any particular words that come to your mind immediately? That
connective tissue comes to mind immediately.
Okay, for sure. Connective.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Etymologically, we have fascist.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're two different etymologies,
Yeah.
fascia and fascist. So, but I mean, you have the words like ubiquitous.
Ubiquitous.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
So you're talking about qualities. I get you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So forgive me for not being clear enough on that.
Binding.
Yeah, binding.
Enveloping. Yeah.
Omnipresent everywhere. So if fascia is everywhere, how can it be not somewhere? So for me, fascia is a process. It's not a thing. It's actually a process in time. It involves things like phase changing. If you think about electrical activity, something that happens slow, like muscle fibers, slow twitch muscle fibers, they sound like this. If you listen to fast twitch muscle fibers, they sound like this. So they're happening, their activity is occurring at about 400 times faster than a slow twitch muscle fiber.
Were you making a sound? Because I think Zoom got rid of your whatever noises you were making.
No way, really? So I was going for the...
Yeah, it did it again.
Zoom's artificial intelligence doesn't like random sounds, and it thinks that they're not meant to be there. So we don't cut that out.
Okay, let's just say it was a single shot from a gun fired every 1.5 seconds, as opposed to an F-16. Or no, not what's a gun? I'm not good at guns. With a machine gun. Going. Boom, boom, boom. I mean that fast. It's 400 times faster. So things are happening on a temporal basis in the human body. Temporality is a huge topic for me. Everything is happening on a temporal basis. If you had an immediate injury, and you should never have spaces in the human body. The human body doesn't allow for space other than your sinus cavities and your urinary bladder, but that fills. And then it empties and it fills. So really, there's never a space there, or there shouldn't be. And if you did have an occasion where somebody injured themselves and there was an immediate space, how would you fill that space? Because remember, the body will not allow spaces. So if that's true, then the body's going to fill it. How would it fill it? And of course, immediately, it's going to fill it with blood or fluids. You see, and that's what it does. And then you go into so how does a heel spur come about? You can't get a heel spur in an overnight. Heel spurs, have to calcify, so they take much longer time to fill that space. But then, having said that, generally speaking, that space is occurring over a long period of time. So as the space is occurring, the body's filling it, and it's filling it with, particular, either tissues or liquids, and then those tissues and liquids are going to go through morphological changes. They become sticky and hard and calcified, and so on. Can you see? So temporality for me I love that. It's a great topic. But we were talking about fascia, and I would say that fascia is a process. It's everywhere. And so for the surgeon, if I'm showing surgeons how to be able to approach retroperitoneal structures on what we would refer to as bloodless planes, then I might be showing them a lateral approach and talking about the various different... Here's another one. I might be talking about the various different fasciae that are in the body, but there are no fasciae in the body. There's only fascia. Fascia is plural, meaning two, and there are not two fasciae in the human body. There's only one fascia in the human body that, has folded back on itself to create what we might refer to as, some pockets, or it has tripled, so it creates triple, double and triple layers or laminae. But it all came from one original fabric. Yeah, all the mesenchyme.
Yeah.
Fascinating, by the way. Fascinating.
It's so rare that we get to talk to somebody who's got such a vast knowledge of both anatomy and language. And we'll probably have 50 different rabbit holes I want to go down here. But I got to ask this question because I've wondered this. You mentioned the letters AE at the end of a Latin name meaning plural. So what is the plural, for example, in the fascia lata or levator scapulae, for example, since there seem to be just singular structures there, but are they in fact plurals because there's AE at the end of it?
Because, again, my brain explodes when you say certain things. So one of the first things I got to say is that please remember that everything I tell you could be completely wrong.
Okay.
So thanks for reminding me.
Yeah. I mean, it's just
good.
Look, it's John Sharkey. I'm speaking based on my 42 years experience, and it's, what I believe to be true. But having said that, if somebody wants to disagree with me, that doesn't mean to say that we can't sit down and have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a cup of a beer and put our arms around each other and still have a good conversation. We don't have to fall out just because we don't agree with each other. So we are segmented. We are segmental human beings, and we do have right and left sides. Why we have a right and left hemisphere, we don't know. We don't know why we have two sides to our brain. That's just an unanswered question. I've discussed this with Ian McGilchrist, who is a famous guy. He has a wonderful book out, very heavy reading. He has 2 new books out, actually. I don't know where these guys get the time to read all the research papers that they have, but he has the Master and His Emissary, which is an amazing book. So we have right and left. So you have a right and left rectus abdominis. So It's not just rectus abdominis, it's a right rectus abdominis and a left rectus abdominis. And so you have a levator scapula. But I suppose you could say levator scapulae if you want to talk about the right and left together in the one sentence.
Interesting.
And tensor fascia latae would be the left and right, you're saying? Okay.
Well, perhaps if you're talking, but it's a tensor fascia lata is
a singular. All right, that's the example. Okay, sure.
Yeah. And of course, it is continuous, because what you find is if you can visualize an embryo, you're sitting within the womb, you'll see that the lower limbs have rotated out and they've spiraled out, and then they've ended up in a particular position, and that position creates specific tensions and compressions. So this is now you're going to now go into a conversation about genetics versus epigenetics. So we have a combination of genetics and epigenetics. If things are not where they're supposed to be, so this argument comes around from time to time where people say to me, alignment and posture are not important. And there are people who have written papers on that, and that's fantastic. I completely disagree with them. I believe, as Ida Rolf used to say, put it where it belongs and ask for movement. And I think she was wise. Maybe we could tweak that, but I think she was wise in what she was saying. Your head needs to be sitting in a particular way on your neck needs to be sitting a particular way on your shoulders, and if not, there's a consequence for that. There's a price to pay. So if your lower limbs are in the right position, you will develop an iliotibial band. If they are not in the right position, you will not develop an iliotibial band, or you will develop the iliotibial band somewhere else, believe it or not.
Really?
If you're a horse rider, or if you're treating horse riders, so for those listeners who treat horse riders, you'll notice that they have iliotibial bands on the medial side of their legs because of the positioning of the feet in the stirrups. So
certainly adductors acting like them, yeah.
Well, the fascia thickens along lines of tension.
Sure, yeah. A thickening in that band, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a communication. That's a conversation that's happening in the human body. It's not down to genetics. It's down to epigenetics. It's down to the influence of the forces operating. And if you're born and your heart is not in the right place in your thoracic cavity, if it's not sitting correctly, then there's an opening between the right and left atria. And unfortunately, that opening will not close, and you will be left with a hole in the heart. So we normally have a small little sticky out piece of tissue, which we call a limbus, the limbus of the fossa ovale. Beautiful. The language is beautiful, isn't it? The limbus of the fossa ovale. And so this will not form. This will not close on birth if your heart is just not in the right position. And therefore, you'll be left, as I say, with a hole in the heart. And we have several other examples of that around the body, and they're everywhere, actually, these little openings or holes.
Yeah. All right. So you're unapologetically structuralist. You would say the structure counts or alignment counts, position matters, as well as posture does. All right.
Usually. And of course, the body has the ability to adapt. And as long as you're functional, that's fantastic. But, this idea that you take an 8-year-old child and you put Harrington rods into their spine to correct a scoliosis, that would not be my approach. I think that's horrific. And our problem is that it'll take another 100 years before we have convinced people, of an alternative way, another way. Even the word alternative is not a great word, because as soon as you say alternative, people start, having certain thoughts in their head, because we have this word alternative versus complementary. So, but yeah, I tend to think that once people can remain functional, then that's pretty cool.
I was listening to Joanne Avison's podcast recently where she was interviewing you, and she said your nickname was Fascia Man at your university.
Yeah, this is all these years. I meet PhDs now, all these years later, and they say when they're introduced to me, or if I'm at an anatomical society meeting, they say, "Oh yeah, you're Fascia Man."
You're the fascia guy.
Idea how they still manage to talk about me and how that goes around. It's just funny. Yeah.
Well, she went on to ask something that while we're on the subject of is posture important, she said how you feel about having the Mickey taken out of you she said dedication to a lost cause, namely fascia. I don't know if you remember that question or not, but it made me curious to hear what you would say to the people who think that fascia is, say, irrelevant or vastly overrated or even a fad that's passé.
Well, there's a couple of things, by the way. I was talking in another school just recently, and they were saying things like, if you want to put the tissue in the bins beneath the cadavers, and I said, look, if you could do me a favor, I'd prefer if you didn't refer to them as bins. Bins are trash cans, and we would never ever encourage anybody to say that they were placing human tissue into a bin or a trash can. And then they said, language is important. Language, if you want to encourage people to leave their bodies to science, then I think we need to pay attention, to these words. What I get sometimes is a little tap on the back to say, oh yeah, John's interested in fascia. John, have a chat with this person. And although they're introducing you to somebody and you kind of think, oh, that was great that they helped you to network. It's the tap on the back that you go, did they just tap me on the back? And you realize that I'm not quite sure if that's being disparaging or what it is.
A little condescending, perhaps. Yeah.
A little condescending, because maybe they know better. And it's very hard for somebody to know what they don't know. It's very hard for somebody to know that. So if you've been encouraged, you see, this is where the focus in anatomy is about where. Where is the superior mesenteric? Where is, of course, everybody loves the vagus nerve. Where is the vagus nerve? My goodness. There's so much to learn about the vagus nerve. I want to send an applaud out to Professor Porges. What a great character he is. What an incredible guy. The polyvagal theory. And he has to take a lot of stick over the polyvagal theory.
Yeah. And about anatomical specificity, amongst others. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of my tutors was the first human being in space. He was an American. Lots of people think that the first human being in space was a cosmonaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin. But in fact, it was my tutor, Professor David Simons of Travell, Simons & Simons. And he was the first human being to go into space. If you don't believe me, you can go on to the internet and look up Man High Project, and you can read all about David and his exploits. And that's how he met Dr. Janet Travell. And Dr. Janet Travell, you probably know, she was the first female physician in the White House. Mm-hmm. She was tending to John F. Kennedy. And she was also, by the way, great at inventing and making things. And she made a specific rocking chair, which is here in Dublin, incidentally, in a restaurant not too far away from me called Shanahan's on the Green. And they have that rocking chair up there. But they were ostracized. They had to take an awful lot of stick over this idea of myofascial trigger points. Mm-hmm. Hey, there's another great one, by the way. Why are we not talking about myofascial trigger points? Why is nobody writing about myofascial trigger points? Is the heart muscle not a muscle? Mustn't be, because nobody has written one iota about myofascial trigger points occurring in the myocardiac tissue, which is just mind-boggling.
Well, that's an interesting thought. I mean, do you think it's possible that some of the other symptoms, like heartburn or things like that, could actually be
heartburn? Oh my goodness! There are people who are experiencing all of the sensations of some type of cardiac insult, and they don't have the pathology. And there's another great area for people to investigate, fertile ground. Mm-hmm. Go and investigate it and see if there's anything there, or no, nothing to see here, move on. But my goodness, we talk about every other single muscle in the human body, and we don't talk about myocardial tissue in terms of myofascial trigger points. I find that extremely, and I'm off doing other things. I just can't I can't be providing, the research on those, but I can encourage people. And your podcast, I think this is the first podcast I've ever mentioned that. I've never mentioned that before to anybody, almost because first, I have too many things to talk about, and number two, but there it is on your podcast. If there's anybody out there involved in research, there's a great area.
That's
for
a fascinating idea.
And,
So now you got me thinking about like trigger points in the tongue, and like where are all these other places that we, muscle tissue that we kind of ignore with potential problems there. So
absolutely, Whitney. Well done. That's brilliant. Now you see what just happened there. I happened to mention the heart.
Yeah.
And within just a couple of seconds, we're off.
Yeah.
We're rolling. Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
So there's so much to be discovered. There really is.
I want to ask you a question about something else that I've heard you make comments about or mention before, and I don't understand quite the concept. I'd love for you to explain it a little bit to our listeners too. When you refer to fascial tuning pegs, tell me a little bit about that, what that is.
Okay, so fascial tuning pegs. Several years ago, I did a research paper with Professor Hongjin Sui in Dalian Medical University in China. And this is on the myodural bridge, which is the connective tissue, the fascia, the connective tissue from the rectus capitis posterior minor, rectus capitis posterior major. Mm-hmm. And this relationship, it is continuous with the dura, the tough mother, the dura mater, of your spinal cord. And in fact, what we didn't include in the paper also, by the way, is that there are specialized little foramina, through which the connective tissue run through your cranium. They run through your cranium to attach to the dura. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So we didn't mention them, but and again, nobody has really done a paper on that I've seen, certainly. Mm-hmm. But so you stop then and you think to yourself, well, let's look at this little muscle on the back of your head. And if you compare it to a quadricep or a biceps brachii or pectoralis major, and you think to yourself, what is its function? Is it involved in moving us in some way, or moving the head? And that's what we tend to think about muscles. Well, it turns out that there are specialized, what you may refer to then as fascial structures in the human body, that when we look at them from a histological viewpoint, we see that they're completely different to neighboring tissues. So then you have to say to yourself, well, why would they be so different? And I think it's reasonable to say, well, then they must be playing a different role. But what role would they be playing? And of course, what's happening with these tissues, they are replete with sensory organs. I mean, replete. If you took 1 inch of muscle fiber from your gluteus maximus and you were to analyze it for muscle spindles, I'm going to give you old figures, by the way, because these figures are changing constantly. Dr. Robert Schleip with Dr. Carla Stecco combined work with another colleague of theirs who had written about the number of nerve fibers that there are in the human body, sensory nerve fibers in the human body. It's now into the hundreds of millions, because they used a 3-dimensional approach, and they also had an average weight of a male and a female. So all of a sudden, our knowledge in terms of these particular specialist sensory organs are just changing. So if you take an inch of muscle fiber in gluteus maximus, you're going to have somewhere in the region of 11 muscle spindles. If you take just that little inch of muscle tissue in rectus capitis posterior minor, you're going to have 11,000. Wow. Let's compare that. 11 to 11,000. Wow. And that might even be, those figures might have to be multiplied by 3. But you ask yourself the question then, what is the function? So gluteus maximus doesn't tell us anything. Gluteus, there's a term to say hip, related to hip. Maximus, it's a big one, so it doesn't tell us anything. And by the way, contract, what does the word contract mean? It means to shrink. We might talk about that another day. Shrink, is that a good word? Because that's what it means. It means to shrink. See, we use these words all the time and we really don't know what they mean. I remember I met a guy, Dr. Chato introduced me to a guy, Andrew Beale, years and years and years ago, and he was writing a book at the time. And I said to him, let me give you a little gift. I said, the word muscles means little mice. And I think Andrew used that in his book, which is a brilliant book. Is it The Trail Guide?
Trail Guide to the
Yeah.
Body. They're actually one of our sponsors on the show.
Wow, and what a fantastic book that is. That's just, and he did, he self-published that and did all the diagrams, and I think he got surprised with the number of sales. And it's just brilliant. I recommend his book everywhere I go. I think it's a beautiful book.
Little mice, though, huh?
Yeah, but so what happened was, again, the listener can't see us, but if you were to move your fingers, and look at how the skin moves on your forearm. The Greeks thought that if you placed a bed sheet or a tablecloth on the ground and you watched a mouse running underneath it, that it made that type of shape, you see? So they called them muscularis.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, your hip bone, acetabulum, vinegar bowl. So if they turned the pelvis, one side of the pelvis on it, if you turned it on its side, it looked like the bowl that they dipped their bread into using a little bit of, vinegar and oil, vinaigrette. So they called it acetabulum. It doesn't tell you anything about the physiology or metabolism or, what is it about. So if we start to look then at what these tissues are doing, we see that they're playing very specific roles. So the one thing that gluteus maximus never does is I'm going to come back now, but if we have the chance time-wise, I'll come back and I'll contradict this. But the term that is, nothing in the human body shortens or lengthens. That's just a complete myth. Nothing in the human body shortens or lengthens.
Tell us more.
Yeah, we're gonna have to dive into that. So
yeah, even if it looks like, well, visually it would be much easier for me to show you, but if it looks like it's shortening, that's exactly what it is. It just looks like it's shortening, but nothing is actually lengthening. Right down to the molecular level, you're just getting things moving relative to each other. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Gluteus maximus never shortens. You never need to do what people call stretching on gluteus maximus. It's just,
you're talking about a resting state, a steady state, a permanent state is fairly constant. There's not great changes in that. Even
never shortens and it's never lengthens.
All right, I'm with you.
What you might get is hypertonicity, increased tension. And by the way, what do we do if you get an upper trapezius and it's tense? Tension is a feeling. Tension is a sensation. So what do? We stretch it. So people look at the medical world, I'm responsible for training undergrad med students and postgrad specialists, and they say, oh, you guys only treat the symptoms. Well, tension is a symptom. And what do we like to do to tension? We like to stretch it. So we like to stretch the symptoms. So be careful about finger wagging, at other people. At the end of the day, people do, they move their head away from their shoulder and they do this thing called a stretch. And it doesn't, like stretching the hamstrings, it just doesn't really do anything. They're stretching it the next day and the next day and the next day.
It doesn't do anything in terms of a permanent deformation or actually changing some physiological length or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you. This is the great thing about conversations. Somebody can come in and just tweak what I said to make it that little bit better. And that's fantastic. We can all offer something there. But let me just finish this real quick then. Yeah. So if we look at rectus capitis posterior minor, really, and remember, we have to use hypotheses. We have to say, could I be wrong? Yes, I could. But based upon the morphology of the tissue, based upon the neurophysiology of the tissue, placed upon its positioning, etc., we know, we can feel confident that this muscle is about giving feedback to you, to the human body, so that you know where you are in time and space. Now, if you've got forward head posture, then you will not know where you are in time and space. So things that you just take for granted, you will walk towards a doorway and you'll get to the doorway quicker before you thought you were going to, or you'll bang your elbow off things, or you'll bump your toe into things, and people who know you will call you awkward. You'll say, what's John? Yeah, God, he's awkward. It's because where you think you are and where you are two different things, because you have forward head posture. So as manual therapists, our job is to see if we can offer therapeutic intervention to help this head to sit back on the neck, in a more appropriate manner, as Eiderolf would have said, put it where it belongs and ask for movement. You were going to say something then, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of get back to the contraction and lengthening thing. So if we talk about let's say a discrete muscle tendon unit that something really simple like the biceps in the arm. If you flex your elbow, you are in fact, and correct me anywhere I'm wrong along this thought process here, you are bringing the two ends closer together, right?
No.
You're not.
No.
Okay.
It's real simple.
Fix me on
Again,
that.
it would be it's actually real simple. And it would be easier to actually do this if we were on Zoom, or if people could see exactly what I'm doing. But if you want to take a particular Sharpie pen, like take a little Sharpie pen and you put a dot somewhere on your shoulder, somewhere to represent, origin of something. And let's say you pick a point just distal to your elbow and you put a little mark there, and you can call that the insertion. Okay. And let's say then what you do is you do that motion that you call, contraction. So you're bending at the elbow joint. If you were to use a soft measuring tape and you hold it in place, you'll notice that the measuring tape doesn't actually change. Measuring tape doesn't get shorter or doesn't get longer. Yeah. So that's a starting point for us. That's just a starting point. So the distance between the origin and the insertion never change. And of course they couldn't, other than you had a dislocation or subluxation, or the tendon tore off the bone. Then something might happen. But that origin and insertion distance are not changing. So,
how are you moving a limb?
Yeah.
How are you moving a limb if the distance is not changing?
I love your premise, by the way. It's so great to have something that blows people's mind. They're going, wait a minute. You're saying, no, you have to turn it around exactly how you think about it, but help me turn it around because I'm not there yet.
Oh, listen, but by the way,
our listeners can't see, but Til and I both have smoke coming out of our ears right now. Trying to wrap my head around this.
We have to remember how have we ended up where we are in terms of anatomy. We could go back several thousand years, but we I tend to go back. I know Joanne works with me quite a lot, and so we're similar in this regard. We tend to go back to René Descartes. So we say that we look at the 17th century, late 1600s. And René Descartes was a horologist. He was a philosopher fascinated in watches and clocks. And so he thought that he could describe all living motion based upon those mechanics. Now, long before him, we had Borelli, and even before him, we had Socrates, and further back, if you wish to go. So we've got this language that we use in the human body where we talk about, for instance, joints. There are no joints in a human body. Now, if I say there's no joints in the human body and somebody goes, what are you talking about? Look at my elbow joint. You have to understand what the word joint means. And unfortunately, people have shortened it. It's actually a pin joint. That's what it means. And a pin joint means that you get two bars that overlap each other, and then you have a pin going between them to hold them together. So we don't have pins going between our bones to hold our bones together. And bone is fascia. Bone is just part of the continuity. It's part of the continuum. It just happens to be a stiffened, hardened connective tissue, harder than the stuff on your face and harder on this stuff that we call little mice. It just happens to be a specialization, not spatialization, but specialization. It's specialist. So if you deposit liver cells into the connective tissue, you'll get a liver. And if you deposit muscle fibers, you'll get muscles. And if you so on, yeah. So now I went from the gross part, from the superficial part, we'd say out of the skin, and we talked about a soft measuring tape, and you hold it in place, and you'll notice that the soft measuring tape doesn't suddenly get smaller or shorter. So that's telling you that those 2 points have remained the same. Now
that's where I don't get you. By soft, you mean flexible. You don't mean elastic. You don't mean it changes its length. You say a measuring tape between the origin and insertion of the biceps a measurement would not change in elbow flexion.
That measurement would not change. But then we have to stop and say, right, okay, well, what about the gaster? What about the gaster of the muscle? So gaster, what does that mean? That means muscle belly. If you had what's the nickname for your stomach? People call it your belly. Okay, so if you had some kind of an illness, a sickness, you might have gastroenteritis. So that's where that word comes from. So the belly of your muscles are your gasters. So we look at the gaster and we see, well, John, if I do this flexing of my elbow joint, then I see some kind of a shape change there. I see it bundling up. What's happening there? And that's really where we'd have to get into the discussion. And unfortunately, I'd say that we're limited in terms of just a conversation where I can't visually show you something. But let's say we go down to the cellular level, or even further down into the nuclear level. You're going to see that nothing shortens. You don't get either atoms or electrons or protons shortening. All they do is they move around each other. They change. They change relative to each other. And that's exactly what's happening. It's scale-free. It's happening at the nano level, and it's happening at the gross level. Although what you're seeing is a shape change. For you guys, once again, I'll come back to the slinky. People can go out and buy a slinky in a toy store. And if you buy that slinky and you hold it on either end and you pull it, you'll see that you're able to bring your hands apart. And the slinky looks like it's lengthening, but nothing's lengthening, although the whole thing is changing.
Okay, let me now in your description, your hands coming apart. Is that a distance change in your vocabulary?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay.
I mean, your hands have moved apart, so your hands are no longer closer together. They're actually
we're in
apart.
agreement about that. Great.
Yeah. So that's where I was getting stuck, is this idea, like the two attachment points being represented by your hands, each one holding the slinky. That distance is changing.
Absolutely, and look, I mean, we've got motion, we've got movement here, so something's changed,
change,
and things are moving. And we've even got angle changes, all that sort of stuff is changing.
Yeah.
But if you look at the slinky, for instance, for those people who are just using your imagination, imagine you're holding a slinky, you're holding either end of the slinky, and you're pulling it. So it's a coiled spring. So what you have in here, is what I'd call redundancy. You see, let me give you another kind of example of it, if I can. And once again, oh gosh, I wish we were together on Zoom or something, just so that I could give you this kind of a visualization. I'm trying to look for a piece of paper. So if I take if I have a piece of paper here, let me see. This is something I'm doing tonight, so I have millions of notes. But I'll take this one here. So I have a piece of paper, okay, and you see that if I push either end of the piece of paper, it goes into it coils into a curl. Can you see that? A U shape, yes? So I take a piece of paper, I'm holding it like an A4 page you'd use in your printer at home. Hold it either end, push it towards each other, and you'll get a U shape. Now,
the paper sags, it's a U. Yep.
Yeah, sags. Now, if I fold it in half, and I take my nail and put a
nice origami crease in there.
They might not like that. Now, if I push it, you see it moves completely different, yes?
Like a V, yeah.
Yeah. Now, if I take that piece of paper, and let's say I do, 3 centimeter folds all the way along the paper. So when I say 3 centimeter folds, for those people listening, what you're now trying to do is you're trying to create like an accordion effect, yes?
Yeah.
And now we have an accordion effect. So now what I do is I take the page, I hold it on one end, and I lengthen it. And then I shorten it. Can you see? I lengthen it and I shorten it. Nothing lengthened and nothing shortened. Why? Because this is a piece of paper.
We know the paper hasn't changed its dimensions or lengths at all.
Watch if I stretch it. Are you ready? Yeah, here we
go.
Now that's lengthening it. And if I take my slinky and if I just take up the redundancy, it looks like it's lengthening and shortening, but no one element of the slinky lengthened or shortened. Now watch this. I take the slinky and I really pull, as we say in Ireland, pull the bejesus out of it. Now look what's happened. Is the slinky damaged? Absolutely.
The slinky's like overstretched and isn't recoiling.
It's not going to go back. You will never get it back. And you can see this written on the abdomens of women who have gone through pregnancy, and they even have the correct name for it.
And this is plastic deformation of the tissue. Yeah. So let me go back a moment, and because this is something I have heard for many years, and I want to clarify my misunderstandings about this in terms of a muscle. When we say a muscle is shortening, this is not what you're saying is, for example, overlapping of sarcomeres, the contractile units in the muscle that allow the two ends to be brought closer together. Is that correct?
You guys have definitely got to have on Dr. Neil Peace from New York University. I'll send him an email. I'll introduce you two guys. Neil has his new book is out. It's you can order it at the moment, and I think it's chapter 5, so that you'll get a whole new explanation of what we used to call the sliding filament theory. That's just
not happening. Huh? Okay.
Not happening. And I think about it, by the way, once again, for the listeners, if you guys place the palms of your hands together and then rub your hands together and say, well, what do you feel? You feel heat. And you feel heat as a consequence of the friction. Mother Nature would never construct a living structure based upon friction. The only way you get friction is the breakdown of chemicals in the production of this thing we call energy. Nobody knows what energy is, but we use it as a language of convenience. So we break down chemicals, we call them adenosine triphosphate, and we produce energy. And when we do so, we produce heat. And that's how the human body produces heat. If you're producing heat by any other means, then that's pathology. So that's not good. You don't want to. That's why people who have arthritic issues, etc., they'll tell you that their joints are on fire. Somebody who's injured themselves and they've got inflammation, they'll tell you that the tissue feels incredibly warm and hot. That's pathological. So really, if you have heat being produced by friction, imagine that, things rubbing off each other. That's not a pleasant thought.
So I know we're getting close to our time limit here, but
I'm really sorry, guys. Yeah,
it's okay. But I want to try to leave one thing with maybe if we can kind of consolidate this into something for our listeners, this whole idea about, we feel a person having limited range of motion and we try to increase their range of motion through stretching, massage, soft tissue manipulation. What are we doing? And is this a good idea? It's like, what's happening here?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, let's put the word stretching aside for a moment. What you're doing is you're trying to return normal physiological range of motion. So there is pre-tension in a human body, and there is, pre-stress. What happens to it? Let's use classical anatomical terms. What happens to a human body on death? Almost immediately.
Rigor mortis. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what a myofascial trigger point is. A myofascial trigger point is rigor mortis. It's a rigor contracture in just a small piece of muscle tissue. There's no need for ATP. There's no need for electromagnetic. There's no need for energy. There's no need for a nerve input. It can stay that way, forever. Isn't that amazing? And what you've got is a rigor contraction. Now, further out from the sarcomere, you may have an end plate dysfunction, and it could involve acetylcholine and all of that. But at the level of the sarcomere, what you have basically is a rigor contraction, which is a form of shortening of the sarcomeres, even though I'm using the word shortening now as because it's convenient for me. But what you're actually getting is you're getting rotations and spirals, and things are moving relative to each other, and therefore, they're creating what we might refer to as a shortening. So those people who are involved, they're stretching, it's just people are trying to return normal physiological or anatomical range of motion because it is short of that range of motion. That can be a beautiful thing to do. I would just say be careful not to to force your agenda on tissues. You have to have a conversation, and that conversation is based upon knowledge and experience.
Yeah. Okay.
Kind of the best I think I could do, Whitney, in the time that we have. I'm really sorry. My other tutor has started class. I know that
well, basically what this has done is this just made me decide that we're going to have it like 6 more episodes to delve into a bunch of this stuff here. So,
but Whitney, you and I go back so many years. It's just great to spend a bit of time with you. Until we've met each other now on a number of occasions, and it's just, you guys are doing such great work. I love it. And to be involved with you guys, and to have the few minutes to spend with you, it's really been super cool.
And every one of our conversations has been a part in ongoing whole and to be continued. So thank you, John. Thanks for taking the time.
I really appreciate it. And thank you again for all the magnificent work you have done. So can you share a little bit for our listeners how they can find you, track you down, follow your work, that kind of thing?
Okay, so I'm useless when it comes to social media. I know people give out to me about it all the time, but Facebook, come on to Facebook. Facebook only allow you to have so many people, so I think it's 5,000 and that's full, but they can follow. Or John Sharkey events.com, and they can learn about me there in those 2 places.
Okay, wonderful. John, thank you again so much for your time. We really appreciate it. This is very fascinating discussion, and definitely to be continued here.
To be continued. So, if you got to go, jump off. We got another minute.
Thanks, guys. Brilliant. Yeah, I'm going to jump off. And I'll talk to you again soon, right?
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Thanks to you both. Bye.
Yeah. So anyway, that was a fascinating discussion with John. He had to zip off our line here, but boy, he brought up so many questions and things for me. I mean, what struck you as being, what really stuck out for you as being, interesting or fascinating?
I really enjoy John's loquaciousness and his stories and his idea of anatomy. I don't know if it's his idea, but his practice of anatomy as a narrative art and historical, personified, language-based picture that we can get of anatomy as stories. And I really relate to his the shared heritage there of being a Rolfer, say, and being in that world where it really, for me, it was my original training was very much in line with what he was describing as position being paramount, and the continuity of different structures being the ones that being the thing that is foreground rather than taking things apart. And then the irony of him being such a precise differentiator in his language and ideas, where describing something in terminology in very precise terms, almost like making distinctions about something that's not distinct and something that is a whole by nature. And so trying to communicate the wholeness of that through fine distinctions. Yeah. Anyway, that's me.
I just found myself, at least 5 or 6 times saying, "Whoa, wait a minute here. I gotta dig into this. What are you talking about?" In just a number of things that he brought up, feeling like I want to explore this further. Like these are many, many rabbit holes that I would want to dive deeper down into. And, I first met John, I think he and I first met at the very first Fascial Research Congress, and that was 98-ish or so, or somewhere around 2000. You remember when that was?
No, I don't, but I remember it was Harvard.
Washington. No, Harvard. Yeah, it was at Harvard in Boston.
Yep.
We had just fascinating conversations over the years. And I just could sit and listen to him, and I gotta, think like he's one of the people who really pushes my envelope in thinking about things a certain way. So I get a lot out of those discussions. So we'll have to continue that.
Any of those book questions you want to bookmarks, or places that you didn't get to dive in as much as you would have liked?
Well, I feel like I still didn't get quite through with this thing about tissues elongating, and are there this thing about positioning movements of the attachment points of bones, that I want to revisit this because I'm not quite there yet. So
I think I know what he's saying. I'm probably doing him a disservice, but I think he's simply saying that the constituent materials don't permanently deform.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. And when he was talking about stretching, we're not really stretching things. That's because if we did actually put the kind of forces on to lengthen at more of a sort of microscopic level of that tissue, then it doesn't have that degree. But then that calls into question, what about elasticity? Tissues have some degree of elasticity, and like you can apply certain loads to them before they deform.
Yes. He was calling that anatomical range or functional range.
Yeah.
Again, it's that question of and the permanent question being the distinguishing word in that conversation. Usually things are changing length all the time, but do they change their permanent or, basic length that they return to?
Yeah.
In the absence of a motor input or things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my guess. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And by the way, fascia, at least Paul Ingram says, fascia and fascist do share a root. Paul Ingram is, as far as last I read, at least not a big fan of fascia. So who knows, maybe that might have a bit of tilt to be that way. In his lens there. But I'm going to send that to John, that they, at least according to Paul, they do share a common root. Although at the end of Paul's article about fascia and fascists, he says, I could be wrong about all this, but who knows?
Yeah. So it's kind of like some of those things are probably a little bit of the game of telephone of like, where did this come from kind of thing. It's like, so
there's that.
Yeah.
There's that.
Yeah.
No, great. So, we had some other things we were going to ask him about. We were going to ask him about biotensegrity. We were going to ask him about, for me, it really is the irony of, like I mentioned, the irony of being very detailed and yet trying to convey and give people the experience of the whole.
Yeah.
So that's what I enjoy. And then his master's story, you set up some storyteller, you set up some tension, you set up some narrative tension by basically debunking some fundamentals. And then you get to build your case around that new view that you're espousing.
Right. So, all right. Well, we'll continue that discussion on a good bit too. So we just wanted to do a sort of a momentary wrap up there after, because there was a lot to take in there. So.
Yeah. All right. So should I thank our sponsors?
Yes, indeed. Let's do.
He mentioned Andrew Beal. Andrew Beal is the author Trail Guide to the Body, published by Books of Discovery, which has been part of massage therapy education for over 20 years. Thousands of schools around the world teach with their textbooks, e-textbooks, and digital resources. Books of Discovery likes to say, learning adventures start here. They see the same spirit here on the Thinking Practitioner Podcast, and they're proud to support our work. knowing we share the mission to bring the massage and bodywork community enlivening content that advances our profession.
So check out their collection of e-textbooks and digital learning resources for pathology, kinesiology, anatomy, and physiology at booksofdiscovery.com, where Thinking Practitioner listeners can save 15% by entering the word thinking at checkout. So we would like to say a thank you to all of our sponsors, and thank you to the listeners for hanging out with us for these fascinating discussions as well. You can stop by our sites for show notes, transcripts, and any extras. You can find that over on my site at academyofclinicalmassage.com. And Til, where can people find that with you?
Advanced-trainings.com. We love to hear from you. It's great to read the little comments you put in your reviews, but it's especially great to get your emails. So if you have questions or things you'd like to hear us talk about, email us at info@thethinkingpractitioner, or just look for us on social media and message us there under our names. My name continues as Til Luca. Whitney?
Yeah, and you can find that for me under my name, Whitney Lowe, on social as well. And I would like to make a plug here about sending notices to us. We will say some things probably on this podcast, or some of our guests may say things from time to time that are somewhat controversial. And I would just like to let everyone know, please write to us. If you don't agree with something that we've said, or you hit something really, hits a button for you or something like that, I like to know those kinds of things, because it really does help us understand more about what's happening here. So please feel free, whatever your feelings and thoughts, we want to hear from you. So please feel free to do that for us as well. In addition, you can rate us on Apple Podcasts, as it helps other people find the show, and you can hear us on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you happen to listen. So please do share the word, tell a friend, and thanks so much for hanging out with us here on The Thinking Practitioner. We will see you on the next time.
That makes me think, if somebody didn't like something we said, can they go gossip to a friend? Can they go tell a friend
hey, why not?
Guys, no, there's no such thing as bad publicity. So yeah, please go tell a friend whatever you want to tell them.
That's right.
Great. It's great that you're listening. Thanks very much, everybody.
Okay.